Flight attendant insults black CEO without knowing he owns the airline at an ordinary airport gate. A flight attendant stopped a well-dressed black man, doubting he belonged in first class. When he calmly tried to show his ticket, she humiliated him in front of dozens of passengers, even slapping his hand away. But what no one knew, not the crew, not the passengers, not even the captain, was that this quiet man wasn't just any traveler. He was the CEO, and he owned every plane, every seat, and every uniform in the airline. By the time they landed, her entire future would hang on a single decision he was about to make. Have you ever witnessed someone judge another person based solely on appearance? What happened next might surprise you. The airport buzzed with morning noise. Luggage wheels bumped against the floor. People rushed in every direction, and the loudspeakers called out gate numbers over and over. Near gate 17, a tall man stood out from the crowd. His name was Marcus Hayes. He wore a simple charcoal gray suit, polished shoes, and carried only a slim black bag. His short hair was speckled with gray at the sides, and his face held a calm, serious look. He checked the boarding pass in his hand, showing first-class seat 1A. Without rushing, he moved toward the boarding area. Marcus's steps were slow but confident. He didn't look around nervously like some passengers. He didn't fumble with his phone or luggage. Everything about him was steady, like a man who knew exactly where he belonged. But not everyone at the gate seemed to see him that way. Behind the boarding desk stood a young flight attendant named Ashley Bennett. She wore a crisp uniform and a bright scarf tied around her neck. Her ponytail was pulled so tight it looked painful. Ashley had a sharp eye for spotting problems, or so she believed. She liked keeping standards in first class, and she didn't like when someone looked like they didn't fit. As Marcus approached, Ashley's face shifted slightly. Her smile became stiff. Her hand moved quickly to block his path. "Sir," she said, keeping her voice polite but firm, "boarding for economy is down that way." She pointed toward another gate without even looking at his ticket. Marcus raised an eyebrow slightly. He held up his boarding pass in front of her face, his voice even and low. "First class, 1A. For a second, Ashley hesitated. Then she gave the boarding pass a quick glance, barely hiding her surprise. She stepped aside without saying anything else. Marcus passed by without a word, keeping his back straight. But just as he walked onto the jet bridge, Ashley muttered under her breath, "Guess money doesn't always buy class." Marcus didn't react. He moved forward as if the words had never touched him. But behind him, a few passengers heard. A businessman in a navy suit frowned slightly. A woman adjusting her baby's carrier glanced up, her mouth tightening. The comment hung in the air like bad smoke, leaving an uneasy feeling behind. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin glowed with soft lighting. The seats were wide, spaced apart like small private islands. Some passengers were already sipping coffee or tucking blankets over their laps. Marcus found his seat without needing help. He placed his bag in the overhead bin with smooth movements, then sat down and folded his hands neatly in his lap. His eyes closed for a moment, not to sleep, but to block out the noise and clear his mind. Ashley entered the cabin a minute later, holding her tablet. Her eyes quickly scanned the rows until they landed on Marcus. Something about seeing him seated there unsettled her. She tightened her grip on the tablet. A voice inside her head whispered that she needed to check again to make sure he belonged there. It wasn't about the ticket, she told herself. It was about doing her job, keeping order. At least that's what she told herself. She made her way down the aisle, her heels clicking softly against the carpet. Marcus opened his eyes slowly when he felt the presence near him. Ashley stood there stiffly, her expression cold. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass again?" she asked, her voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Without speaking, Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the ticket. He handed it to her with the same calm as before. Ashley snatched it roughly, her fingers brushing against his hand with more force than needed. A man 2 seats away shifted uncomfortably. Ashley stared at the ticket for longer than necessary, looking for a mistake that wasn't there. When she found none, her face grew tight with anger. Without thinking, she shoved the ticket back toward Marcus. Her hands smacked against his fingers hard enough that the ticket slipped free and floated to the floor. A soft gasp rose from the seats behind them. Marcus leaned down slowly, picked up the boarding pass, and straightened again. His face showed no anger, only a deep, silent patience that somehow made Ashley feel smaller than she ever had. "You have no idea who you just disrespected," Marcus said quietly. His voice wasn't raised. He didn't make a scene, but somehow his calm words sounded louder than any shouting ever could. Ashley blinked, confused for a moment, as a heavy, tense silence spread through the cabin. Passengers stopped pretending not to watch. The air seemed to thicken, every eye drawn to the quiet storm that had just begun at seat 1A. Have you ever felt that moment when a room changes temperature instantly? When everyone knows something significant just happened, but no one quite understands what? Ashley froze for a second, unsure what to say. She could feel the eyes burning into her back. She quickly straightened her uniform, forcing a tight smile onto her face. "My apologies, sir," she said in a voice that sounded thin and false. "Just following standard checks." But even she knew her words didn't carry any real weight anymore. Marcus did not respond. He simply returned the boarding pass into his jacket pocket and turned his head away as if Ashley no longer existed. The way he dismissed her without even raising his voice hit harder than any shouting could have. Ashley felt her cheeks burning. And for the first time that morning, a small crack appeared in her perfect professional mask. Trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling, Ashley turned and hurried toward the galley at the front of the plane. She pulled the curtain shut behind her, pretending to check her tablet, but really just needing a moment to catch her breath. She told herself it wasn't a big deal, just a misunderstanding, just another difficult passenger. She had handled worse, hadn't she? In the cabin, Marcus sat still. He glanced out of the window, watching the ground crew loading bags below. His face stayed calm, but inside, a storm was already gathering. He had seen this treatment before too many times. Different faces, different uniforms, but the same attitude hiding behind fake smiles. He wasn't surprised. He was simply waiting. As the final passengers boarded, another flight attendant entered first class. Her name was Susan Carter. She was older than Ashley, with soft brown hair pinned neatly back and kind lines around her eyes. Susan immediately sensed the tension hanging in the cabin. Her gaze swept the room. Landing briefly on Marcus, she gave him a small, polite nod, which he returned with the smallest lift of his chin. Susan moved quietly from seat to seat, checking on passengers, offering water and warm towels. She passed Marcus without stopping, sensing somehow that he wanted to be left alone for now. Across the cabin, Ashley stayed near the galley, pretending to study the safety checklist. But no amount of pretending could erase the feeling growing inside her. The feeling that something was wrong. The way Marcus had looked at her wasn't angry or rude. It was worse. It was a warning she had not yet understood. At that moment, the intercom crackled, and the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 727 with direct service to Atlanta. We are just finishing our final checks and should be pushing back shortly." Passengers relaxed into their seats. Some closed their eyes. Some pulled out books. The tension seemed to ease for them, but not for Ashley. She stood rigid behind the galley curtain, tablet clutched tightly in her hands, heart beating a little faster than before. She couldn't explain it, but she had the strange feeling that this flight was not going to be like any other flight she had worked. And deep in seat 1A, Marcus sat quietly, watching the sky beyond the glass, knowing exactly what was coming. The plane rolled back from the gate, and the engines hummed louder as it lined up for takeoff. Inside the first-class cabin, the soft chime of the seatbelt sign turning off brought a quiet shuffle of movement. Flight attendants moved down the aisles with trays of drinks, their smiles practiced and polite. Susan passed Marcus again, offering him a drink, but he simply shook his head. He didn't need anything yet. He was waiting. Ashley stayed at the far end of the cabin, her steps careful, her smile stiff. She couldn't get Marcus's voice out of her head. "You have no idea who you just disrespected." The words looped over and over, each time heavier than the last. Every time she looked at him, seated so calmly in 1A, her stomach twisted tighter. She told herself she had followed procedure. She told herself appearances mattered, but none of her usual excuses seemed strong enough now. Across the aisle, a businessman in a crisp blue suit opened his laptop. He glanced toward Marcus more than once, sensing that something had happened. Near the window, a middle-aged woman sipped wine and pretended to read a magazine, though her eyes kept flickering up from the pages. The cabin buzzed with unspoken tension, like a room where everyone felt a storm coming, but no one dared speak of it. Marcus sat quietly, hands folded in his lap, his eyes half closed. But inside he measured every move, every glance, every silence. He had spent years in rooms where he wasn't expected to belong. Airports, meetings, boardrooms. It was all the same. He had built something bigger than most could imagine. Yet small minds could only see his skin, his clothes, his quietness. Today would be no different, except today the consequences would not be hidden. After a while, Ashley made herself walk down the aisle again. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she neared Marcus's seat. She glanced at him quickly, pretending she wasn't nervous, pretending she wasn't still defending herself in her own mind. "Would you like a drink, sir?" she asked, her voice almost robotic. Marcus looked up at her, his eyes calm, but sharp. "No, thank you," he said, his tone polite but heavy, making even those 3 words feel like a warning. Ashley nodded quickly and moved on, her hands shaking slightly as she pushed the service cart forward. In the galley, she leaned against the wall for a second, breathing hard. She wiped her palms on the sides of her skirt, trying to calm herself. This wasn't supposed to happen. First class was supposed to be smooth, easy, predictable, but somehow one mistake, one assumption was now standing in the middle of her perfect flight, and she didn't know how to fix it. She didn't know that it was already too late. The flight settled into a steady rhythm as the plane leveled out high above the clouds. Trays clattered softly, cups were filled, and the faint scent of coffee drifted through the air. But the uneasy feeling in the first-class cabin never went away. Marcus sat still, his hands resting lightly on the armrests, his face unreadable. From time to time, passengers glanced his way, sensing something different about him, something they couldn't quite name. Near the front, Ashley kept glancing at her tablet, pretending to check service lists. Her mind raced, running over every second of the boarding process, trying to convince herself she hadn't done anything wrong. Maybe he was just another unhappy passenger. Maybe he would cool off. Maybe by the time they landed, it would all be forgotten. But deep down, Ashley knew she had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Have you ever felt that sinking feeling when you realize you've made a mistake that can't be easily fixed? When an apology feels too small for the damage you've caused? Halfway through the flight, a man in a dark suit came quietly down the aisle. He wasn't part of the regular crew. His suit was sharper, his shoes shinier, his badge tucked neatly on his jacket showed he was someone important. His name was James Thornton, and he was a senior operations manager for the airline, flying today on a routine inspection trip. Most of the crew hadn't even noticed him board earlier. James paused near first class, scanning the cabin with careful eyes. When he saw Marcus, his face shifted instantly. His stiff, professional look softened into something almost respectful. Without hesitation, James stepped forward and bent slightly at the waist, a small but clear sign of recognition. "Good afternoon, sir," James said in a low voice. "Please let me know if there's anything you need." Marcus nodded once, acknowledging him. The exchange was short, but for those paying attention, it spoke volumes. Ashley, standing near the galley, watched the scene with confusion tightening in her chest. Why would a senior manager show that kind of respect to a passenger? Her mind raced, piecing together things she didn't understand. James moved away after a moment, leaving Marcus in silence once again. But now the air in first class felt heavier. Ashley felt it pressing against her, and so did a few of the passengers sitting nearby. The quiet glances toward Marcus grew more curious, more cautious. Something wasn't normal here. Ashley gripped the back of a seat, her knuckles turning white. She tried to steady herself, but her legs felt shaky. Part of her wanted to hide in the galley and wait for the flight to end. Another part, the stubborn part, refused to believe she had done anything serious. It was just a misunderstanding, she told herself again, clinging to the thought like a lifeline. But deep inside, fear was already starting to bloom. The plane continued slicing through the clouds, steady and smooth, but the tension inside the cabin only thickened. Ashley adjusted the collar of her uniform, feeling sweat at the back of her neck. She tried to keep busy, refilling glasses and straightening headrests, but her mind wasn't with her hands anymore. Every few minutes, her eyes flickered back to seat 1A, where Marcus remained as still as a mountain. Passengers around Marcus seemed to sense the weight, too. The businessman across the aisle closed his laptop without finishing his email. The woman with the magazine hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. Even the young couple near the front, who had been giggling over a movie, now sat more quietly, sneaking glances toward Marcus and then toward Ashley. Ashley hated the feeling. She wasn't used to being watched. She was used to controlling the room, setting the tone, making sure first class felt exclusive. But now she felt trapped, like every move she made was being measured. She moved faster, trying to stay ahead of her thoughts, but they chased her down the narrow aisles like shadows she couldn't outrun. James Thornton had taken a seat 2 rows back, flipping through a report, but glancing up now and then at Marcus. His face remained neutral, but his respect for Marcus was clear in every glance. Ashley caught herself staring at him too long and quickly turned away, her heart hammering against her ribs. At the front of the cabin, Susan noticed the growing tension. She whispered quietly to Ashley as they passed each other in the aisle. "Everything all right?" Susan whispered. Ashley forced a smile so tight it hurt. "Fine, just first flight nerves," she whispered back, brushing past quickly before Susan could ask more. But Susan wasn't convinced. She had been working flights long enough to know when something wasn't right. And whatever was happening here, it wasn't normal turbulence. Another hour passed. Drinks were served, trays cleared, lights dimmed slightly for the afternoon flight. It should have felt peaceful. It didn't. Every step Ashley took past seat 1AA felt heavier, like she was walking through water. She didn't dare make eye contact with Marcus anymore. She told herself that maybe once they landed, everything would blow over. Maybe he would just file a complaint and it would go into a folder with a dozen others and she would get a small warning and move on. That's how things usually work, wasn't it? But deep down, a colder voice whispered something she didn't want to hear. This isn't going to be just a complaint. Just before the descent announcement, the curtain to the first-class galley pulled back sharply. Ashley jumped slightly. James Thornton stood there, his expression serious now. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice low but firm. She straightened her shoulders, instinct taking over. "Yes, sir. I need you to prepare for a passenger announcement," James said. "We'll be making it shortly before landing." Ashley blinked. That was strange. Flight announcements didn't usually involve first-class attendants directly. Before she could ask anything, James added, "And after that, you'll be expected to come forward." Her mouth opened, then closed. She couldn't find the words. James didn't explain further. He simply gave a short nod and disappeared behind the curtain again. Ashley stood frozen in place, clutching the service cart like it might anchor her. The fear she had been pushing down all flight long surged up her throat like a rising tide. Whatever was about to happen, it was bigger than she thought. Much bigger. She glanced once more toward Marcus. He sat calmly in his seat, looking out of the window, one hand resting lightly on his knee. He looked like a man waiting for something, and Ashley knew with a cold, sinking certainty that he wasn't waiting for the flight to land. He was waiting for her world to change. The minutes dragged like hours. Every second felt stretched thin, like the whole cabin was holding its breath. Ashley stood near the galley, pretending to organize trays but mostly gripping the counter to keep her hands from shaking. She kept replaying the morning in her head. Every look, every word, trying to find some way to explain it all if someone asked. But deep down, she knew explanations wouldn't save her. Not this time. The loudspeaker chimed, and the captain's voice broke the heavy silence. Ladies and gentlemen, as we begin our descent, please return to your seats and ensure your seat belts are fastened. We will have an important message shortly. Thank you. Passengers shuffled in their seats, buckling up, adjusting pillows. But even among the usual landing preparations, something felt different. Eyes darted around the cabin, curious and nervous. Everyone sensed something bigger was coming, even if they didn't understand it yet. Marcus remained seated in 1A, his face calm, untouched by the tension he had quietly built around him. He leaned back slightly, folding his hands together, looking every bit like a man at peace, or maybe a man ready to deliver a judgment. James Thornton stepped forward carrying a small wireless microphone. His face was calm but serious, his footsteps slow and steady. Ashley's stomach twisted into tighter knots as she watched him. She had never seen a senior manager take over the speaker during a flight. Not once. Whatever was happening wasn't routine. James cleared his throat and the cabin went completely silent. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice strong and steady. We would like to take a moment to acknowledge a very important guest traveling with us today in seat 1A. Heads turned instantly toward Marcus, some passengers leaning into the aisles to see better. Ashley's knees nearly gave out. Her hands gripped the counter behind her until her knuckles turned white. James continued, It is our great honor to welcome Mr. Marcus Hayes, founder, chairman, and chief executive officer of Horizon Airways, the parent company of the airline you are flying with today. A ripple of gas ran through the cabin. Mouths opened in shock. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even Susan, who had worked for the airline for years, stood rooted in place, her mouth slightly open. Ashley felt the blood drain from her face. Her ears rang so loudly she barely heard the rest of James's words. She stared at Marcus, frozen in her spot, her body refusing to move, her mind refusing to accept what she had just heard. Marcus Hayes wasn't just a first-class passenger. He wasn't just a businessman. He was the owner of the entire airline. The man whose name she had seen 100 times on the company newsletters, plaques in training rooms, photos at award ceremonies. The man she had brushed aside without a second thought. The man she had doubted, disrespected, shoved aside like he didn't belong. James handed the microphone to Marcus with a respectful nod. Marcus stood up slowly, towering above the stunned cabin. His movements were smooth, measured, full of quiet authority. He looked out at the passengers, at the crew, his gaze sharp, but not cruel. He raised the microphone to his mouth, and in a voice that was calm and powerful at the same time, he spoke. It's important to remember something. Respect is not worn on the outside. It's not stitched into a jacket or pinned to a name badge. It's in how we treat people when we think no one is watching. A deep silence filled the cabin. Passengers listened without blinking. Ashley stood behind the curtain, unable to move, feeling every word slice through her. Marcus's eyes scanned the cabin, landing briefly, pointedly on Ashley. Even though he said nothing more about her directly, the look was enough. It was a mirror, forcing her to see herself as she really was. Not the version she had always believed. Marcus handed the microphone back to James with a quiet thank you. Then he sat down again, crossing one leg calmly over the other, as if he had never been disturbed in the first place. The silence in the cabin stretched long after the announcement ended. It wasn't the silence of boredom. It was the heavy, thick silence of people seeing something they could not forget. Ashley stood there frozen, feeling as if the floor beneath her feet had disappeared completely. The wheels of the plane touched down with a soft thud, and a collective breath seemed to escape the cabin. But the relief of landing was not enough to erase the tension that hung like thick smoke in the air. The passengers remained unusually quiet, stealing glances at Marcus Hayes, who sat with the same calm dignity he had held from the beginning. As the plane taxied to the gate, the flight attendants moved through the final motions of securing the cabin. Susan moved quietly and professionally, but her eyes often drifted toward Ashley, who stood stiffly by the galley, her hands clasped so tightly behind her back they trembled. Susan didn't ask any questions. She could see enough in Ashley's pale face and lowered eyes. Ashley wanted to disappear. Every second stretched painfully long. Her throat was dry. Her heart thumped loudly in her ears. She couldn't believe how badly things had spiraled out of control. She had made assumptions without thinking. She had acted with arrogance without even realizing it at the time. And now she had disrespected not just any passenger, but the man who literally owned the airline she worked for. The plane finally came to a stop at the gate. The familiar sound of the seatbelt sign turning off clicked through the cabin, but still no one rushed to their feet. It was as if the normal rhythm of travel had been suspended, held back by the unseen weight pressing down on them. Then James appeared at the front of the cabin once again. His face was even more serious now. He held a small folder in his hand, and when he spoke, his voice was low, but carried a tone that demanded attention. "Miss Bennett," he said, addressing Ashley without needing to raise his voice, "please step forward." The words struck her like a blow. She hesitated for half a second, but then her feet moved on their own. She walked stiffly down the aisle, her head down, feeling every pair of eyes follow her. The walk from the galley to the front of the plane felt longer than any walk she had ever taken in her life. She stopped near the first row, standing awkwardly beside James, wishing she could shrink into nothing. Marcus remained seated, his eyes on her, calm but unreadable. James cleared his throat. "Due to the events witnessed by passengers and crew today, and due to a direct violation of our company's ethics and customer service standards, Flight Attendant Ashley Bennett will be removed from duty, immediately pending an internal review." A gasp echoed from a few seats. Someone dropped a magazine onto the floor. Ashley's face flushed hot and cold all at once. Her hands shook as she struggled to keep them at her sides. James continued, "An apology is not just expected. It is necessary. Miss Bennett, the floor is yours." The silence was so thick it was almost hard to breathe. Ashley opened her mouth, but for a long second. No words came out. Her throat closed up, shame and fear locking inside her chest. But there was no way out now, no excuse strong enough, no defense left to hide behind. She turned to face Marcus fully, her eyes struggling to meet his. When she finally spoke, her voice was small, but it carried through the cabin because of the deep quiet that surrounded them. "I am deeply sorry for the way I treated you today, sir," she said, with her voice trembling. "I made assumptions I had no right to make. I showed disrespect where I should have shown professionalism and kindness. I let my judgment and pride blind me. I humiliated you without cause, and for that I am truly ashamed." Her eyes burned, but she blinked the tears back. This wasn't the time for crying. It was the time for facing what she had done. Marcus listened without changing his expression. He didn't rush to interrupt her. He didn't soften or frown. He simply listened, giving her the full weight of her own words back in silence. When Ashley finished, she stood still, her head slightly bowed. She had no idea what would happen next. Part of her expected Marcus to unleash anger, to demand she be fired on the spot, to humiliate her the way she had humiliated him. But Marcus only nodded once, slow and measured. Then he stood up. Even standing in the quiet cabin, he didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. His presence alone was enough. "You can't undo a moment once it's passed," Marcus said calmly, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience, of battles fought and dignity defended. "But you can choose what you become after it. Remember that." He didn't look at her with hatred. He didn't speak with cruelty. He offered something much heavier, a chance to become better, or to fall even further. Marcus picked up his bag from the overhead bin without any help, adjusted his jacket, and walked calmly toward the exit. The passengers parted silently to let him through, some nodding respectfully as he passed. No one spoke. No one needed to. Ashley remained standing at the front of the plane, her shoulders trembling, the sound of Marcus's footsteps fading behind her, and with them the version of herself she could no longer return to. Have you ever had a moment that forced you to truly see yourself? A mirror so clear you couldn't look away from the truth it showed. The moment Marcus stepped off the plane, it felt like the very air changed. It was lighter somehow, but not for Ashley. She remained frozen at the front of the cabin, her hands still locked together in front of her, every muscle in her body stiff with shame. Around her, the other passengers began to move at last, standing up, gathering their bags, speaking in hushed voices, but even their movements were slower, more careful than usual, like they all knew they had witnessed something they shouldn't forget too easily. Susan passed by Ashley on her way to help a passenger with an overhead bin. She gave Ashley a brief look, not cruel, not smug, but heavy with understanding. Susan had seen many mistakes over her years, but she had never seen one like this unfold so publicly. With no place left for anyone to hide, Ashley barely heard the usual goodbye announcements over the speakers. Her mind was stuck, replaying Marcus's words again and again. You can't undo a moment once it's passed, but you can choose what you become after it. She felt like she was standing at a cliff's edge, and there was no safe way back to where she had been. As the last passengers left the cabin, James Thornton approached her again. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply handed her a printed letter that had clearly been prepared during the final part of the flight. "You're relieved of duty for now," he said firmly. "Security will escort you to the crew office when you step off the aircraft. You'll meet with the disciplinary board tomorrow morning." Ashley took the letter with trembling fingers. The words blurred in front of her eyes, but she knew what it said, even without reading it fully. Suspension pending investigation, immediate review of conduct, recommendation for mandatory sensitivity and diversity training, terms that felt heavy and cold compared to the pride she once felt wearing her uniform. James hesitated before walking away. He lowered his voice so only Ashley could hear. "You should know, Mr. Hayes is not a man who embarrasses people for pleasure. If he called you out like that, it's because he believes people can change if they are given the choice to." Ashley nodded slowly, unable to form any words in return. James gave her one last look, half warning, half mercy, and then disappeared down the jet bridge after the passengers. Ashley stood alone in the hollow cabin. The faint smell of coffee and fabric cleaner filled the air. The seats were empty now, pillows left crumpled, safety cards sticking out of pockets. The cabin that once felt like a kingdom she ruled now felt like a courtroom where she had just lost everything. She made her way down the aisle slowly, her feet heavy, her head bowed. Every step reminded her of the countless flights she had walked with pride, thinking she was better, thinking she was right to judge who belonged and who didn't. Now those same steps felt like a trail of mistakes she couldn't erase. At the aircraft door, two uniformed security officers stood waiting. Their faces were blank, professional, but Ashley felt their judgment without them saying a single word. She nodded stiffly and followed them down the empty jet bridge. As she walked, she caught a glimpse through the wide airport windows. In the distance, Marcus Hayes stood near a row of black cars waiting outside the terminal. A driver held the door open for him. He paused for a moment before getting in, looking back toward the terminal as if remembering something. Ashley wondered if he was thinking of her, or if she was already just another forgotten mistake in a long career of people underestimating him. But deep inside, she knew the truth. She would never forget him. When she reached the crew office, she sat alone at a plain wooden table, her badge and ID placed in a small envelope before her. She was no longer a flight attendant for now. She was just Ashley Bennett, a woman who had to sit in the silence she had created, face the reflection she had avoided for too long, and decide what kind of person she was going to become. Outside the room, airport announcements echoed through the halls. Flights were still taking off, business still moving forward. The world didn't stop for one person's mistakes, but for Ashley, time had slowed to a painful crawl. forcing her to feel every second of what she had lost. Not just a job, not just a reputation, but a piece of herself. The part that once thought she knew what fairness looked like without ever truly understanding it. She sat there staring at the floor with the heavy silence pressing down, knowing the hardest part of her journey was only just beginning. What would you have done in her position? Have you ever been forced to confront your own biases so publicly? When it comes to respect and dignity, appearances can be deceiving, but our actions never lie. Perhaps today we can all take a moment to reflect on how we treat others when we think no one is watching.